Today we're diving into 10 of the most horrifying caving stories ever recorded. Each one is a chilling reminder of how quickly adventure can turn into disaster deep beneath the earth. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The exploration of Roaring River Cave began with meticulous planning. A team of specialized cave divers assembled to conduct a survey of the underwater passages within this Missouri cave system. Eric Hahn, a 27-year-old diver, had a specific role assigned for the October 14, 2022 operation. He would place stage bottles at strategic depths and serve as a safety diver for the team venturing deeper into the cave. The dive plan divided the team into specific roles. 2 divers would form the deep team, pushing into the furthest reaches of the cave. Hahn would work with a 3rd diver to position extra breathing gas cylinders at 40 meters, 130 feet, and 58 meters, 190 feet, below the surface, creating safety checkpoints for the deeper exploration. These stage bottles would provide emergency gas reserves at critical points throughout the underwater cave system. Roaring River Cave presented unique challenges. Its underwater passages descended rapidly from the entry point, requiring technical diving skills and specialized equipment. The cave's limestone passages formed a complex 3-dimensional maze, with narrow restrictions alternating with larger chambers. Water clarity could change dramatically within minutes if sediment was disturbed from the cave floor. The morning of the dive began with standard pre-dive checks. Each team member verified their equipment, gas supplies, and reviewed emergency procedures. Technical cave diving demands redundant systems and extensive backup planning. Hahn was using a closed-circuit rebreather, advanced equipment that recycles breathing gas by scrubbing carbon dioxide and adding precise amounts of oxygen as needed. This technology allows for longer underwater times, but requires careful monitoring and maintenance. At 11:12 a.m., Eric Hahn entered the water. His descent followed the guideline, a continuous safety rope that shows the way out of the cave, as he made his way to the deeper sections. The temperature dropped noticeably as he descended, and the ambient light from the surface entrance quickly faded to complete darkness, illuminated only by his powerful dive lights. 12 minutes into the dive, at 11:24 a.m., Hahn reached the 58-meter, 190-foot tie-off point. Here, he had a brief interaction with a member of the deeper dive team. This diver later reported that Hahn appeared normal during this encounter, with no signs of distress or confusion. Hahn continued with his assigned task of positioning the stage bottle at this depth. What happened next occurred with alarming speed. At 11:25 a.m., just 1 minute after the seemingly normal interaction, Hahn suddenly collided forcefully with his partner, Diver 3, and began swimming upward rapidly, a dangerous action at such depth. This sudden behavior change signaled a serious problem. Diver 3 immediately recognized the emergency and pursued Hahn to provide assistance. He managed to catch up with the rapidly ascending diver when Hahn struck a rocky ceiling at 50 meters, 165 feet. At this point, Hahn was visibly struggling with his rebreather breathing loop. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Diver 3 attempted to help by reaching for Hahn's bailout regulator, an emergency breathing source separate from the rebreather. Before the helper could properly position it, Hahn pulled his rebreather mouthpiece out without closing it, a critical error that allowed water to flood the breathing circuit. As Diver 3 inserted the bailout regulator and purged it to clear water, Hahn began to convulse violently. These convulsions were consistent with oxygen toxicity seizure, a serious medical emergency that can occur when a diver breathes gas with too high an oxygen partial pressure at depth. During such seizures, a diver loses consciousness and control of bodily movements, creating an immediately life-threatening situation underwater. Diver 3 struggled to position Hahn in the rescue position while maintaining control of both the convulsing diver and the emergency regulator. The physical demands of this rescue attempt at depth were enormous. The pair sank to the bottom of the cave passage at 62 meters, 204 feet. Visibility deteriorated rapidly as the struggle disturbed the fine silt covering the cave floor. Eventually, the conditions became too dangerous for the rescue to continue. Diver 3 had lost visual contact with the guideline, the critical safety rope that marked the exit path. Continuing the rescue attempt without this reference point risked both divers becoming lost in the cave. Physical exhaustion was setting in, and Diver 3's own gas supplies were diminishing. Meanwhile, Diver 1 from the deeper team had ascended to get help. Diver 3, forced to abandon the rescue attempt, began his ascent and encountered a member of the deeper team, Diver 2, during a decompression stop. This diver attempted to descend to assist Han, but faced the same challenges: limited visibility, distance from the safety line, and dangerously high oxygen levels in his own breathing gas at that depth. At 11:35 a.m., just 23 minutes after Han had entered the water, another team member, Diver 4, descended to approximately 18 meters, 58 feet, and observed Diver 3 returning without Han. This observation confirmed to the surface team that the mission had shifted from rescue to recovery. The surface manager made the difficult but necessary decision to halt any further rescue attempts, instructing all divers to complete their required decompression stops and exit safely. Professional recovery operations began at 4 p.m. when the Missouri Highway Patrol Technical Diving Team arrived. They located Han's body at approximately 61 meters, 200 feet depth. The post-recovery examination provided important clues about what had occurred. Han's rebreather loop was open and removed from his mouth. His bailout regulator was in his mouth with a slight free flow of gas. His cylinders still contained breathing gas, indicating that running out of gas had not been the primary issue. The subsequent analysis by cave diving experts identified several critical factors that likely contributed to the tragedy. Han appeared to have miscalculated or misunderstood the maximum operating depths for his breathing gases. His diluent gas, the base gas used in his rebreather, lacks sufficient helium content for operations at this depth. This would have increased his susceptibility to nitrogen narcosis, a condition similar to intoxication that impairs judgment and slows reaction times proportionally to depth. Additionally, evidence suggested Han had been manually adding significant amounts of oxygen to his breathing loop. At 58 meters, 190 feet, even small additions of oxygen can rapidly increase the partial pressure to dangerous levels, potentially triggering the oxygen toxicity seizure that was observed. The cave diving section's analysis noted that individual susceptibility to oxygen toxicity varies significantly between divers. While some people can tolerate brief exposures to elevated oxygen levels, others may experience seizures with minimal exposure. The investigation could not determine if Han had any undisclosed medical conditions or was taking medications that might have lowered his seizure threshold. The Roaring River Cave incident underscored several fundamental principles of technical cave diving safety. Proper gas planning, strict adherence to maximum operating depths for breathing gases, and conservative oxygen exposure limits are not merely guidelines, but critical safety boundaries. The incident also highlighted the extreme difficulty of performing underwater rescues at significant depths, especially when visibility is compromised and the affected diver is incapacitated. For the cave diving community, the loss of Eric Han became a sobering reminder of the unforgiving nature of underwater caves and the critical importance of proper training, equipment configuration, and gas management. The team members who attempted to save him demonstrated extraordinary courage, but the combination of depth, gas toxicity, and rapid onset of symptoms created a situation where rescue became impossible despite their best efforts. The waters of Roaring River Cave continue to flow, carrying the memory of a young explorer whose final dive serves as both a tragedy and a learning opportunity for those who venture into the hidden underwater worlds beneath Missouri's landscape. The morning of August 20th, 2015, began like any other for three 18-year-old friends in Montana. They gathered around, excitedly mapping their adventure to Ophir Cave. Their hearts raced with anticipation, completely unaware that their poor planning would soon lead them into 24 hours of escalating terror. The three teenagers, 2 males and 1 female, had underestimated the cave's dangers. They had no helmets to protect their skulls from the rock ceilings. Each carried only a single light source, with no backups for emergencies. Their clothing was inadequate for the cave's bone-chilling cold, where the temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. Most alarmingly, their plan to navigate the cave's vertical drops revealed their deadly ignorance. Instead of proper climbing equipment, they brought 1.5-pound folding kayak anchors, simple boat anchors, to use as hooks. Their safety rope was cotton core utility line from Walmart, with a working load of only 200 pounds, barely enough to support a single person's weight, let alone withstand the forces of a fall. Before leaving for his morning work shift, one of the young men told his coworker that if he didn't show up for work the next day, it would be because he was stuck in a cave. This comment, though said as a joke, would later prove important. By late afternoon, they entered Ophir Cave at 6 p.m. The temperature dropped around them as they went deeper, their flashlights showing only small areas of the vast darkness. Millions of tons of rock now stood between them and the world above. An hour into their journey, they confronted their first obstacle, a vertical drop of 30 feet, 9.14 meters. Here, they put their flawed plan into action. One of them wedged a boat anchor, a device never designed for human safety, into a crack in the rock. They tied many knots along their weak rope to create what was supposed to be handholds. The female waited anxiously at the edge while the two males began their descent, dangling over the depths, supported only by their grip strength and a weak rope. The cotton fibers stretched alarmingly with each movement. One slip, one failure of the improvised anchor, and they would fall onto the unforgiving rock below. Reaching the bottom of the first drop, they immediately faced an even more terrifying challenge, a second drop of 60 feet, 18.28 meters. Their flashlights weren't strong enough to light up the bottom. Nevertheless, they repeated their unsafe method, tossing the boat anchor until it caught on something and began climbing down into the deep darkness. Halfway down the second drop, something went wrong for the first time. Maybe it was a warning sign. One teen's foot slipped on the rope, sending rocks cascading down onto his friend below. The sharp stone struck his companion's shoulder and arm, causing cuts and severe pain. The injured teen screamed in pain, but then reassured his companions that he can still make it through. After several hours exploring the lower chambers, physical exhaustion and falling body temperatures forced them to attempt their return to the surface. The cave's relentless cold had numbed their fingers and drained their strength. Their breath made small clouds in front of their fading flashlights as they realized a horrifying reality. Neither had the strength to climb back up. Attempt after failed attempt left them increasingly exhausted. Their muscles, weakened by cold and fatigue, couldn't manage the climb. The overhand knots that had barely assisted their descent now became impossible obstacles. Each failed try brought them closer to complete exhaustion. They called out for help to their friend above. She had no other option but to get rescue. However, things were about to get troublesome. The female member of their group faced her own terrifying nightmare. Without guidance and with her single light source growing dim, she became hopelessly lost in the upper passages. What should have been a simple 15-minute journey to the exit transformed into an endless maze of identical rock formations and branching passages. Each wrong turn led deeper into disorientation. As hours passed, panic tightened its grip. As her light beam got weaker, she had no extra batteries, no backup light source either. The absolute darkness of the cave, a darkness so complete it can cause hallucinations, threatened to swallow her completely. By midnight, the trapped teens faced the terrifying prospect of spending the night in the cave. The temperature felt increasingly unbearable as their bodies lost heat to the cold stone floor. Even their light sources began to fail, leaving them in periods of complete blackness that triggered deep fears. The injured teen's pain worsened as the cold caused his muscles to stiffen around his wounds. In a desperate bid for warmth, they made a decision that revealed their growing panic. They cut their rope, which was their only potential escape route, into 6-inch pieces and burned them. The short-lived flames gave little warmth while destroying their last chance of self-rescue. To make matters worse, the smoke started burning their lungs and making breathing difficult. The air quality becoming poorer added to their growing list of problems. Morning arrived in the world above, but in the depths of Ophir Cave, the teens remained trapped, one lost and disoriented, while the other two stuck with no escape. The nightmare continued, and they were on the verge of giving up. They had no contact with the outside world, and their only hope was that if somebody notices them gone missing. Same day, when one of the males failed to show up for work, his concerned coworker remembered the joke about being stuck in a cave. The coworker drove to the teen's house, finding it empty, then continued to Ophir Cave, where he discovered their truck still parked nearby. With growing worry, the coworker entered the cave mouth. Just inside, he found the female, still wandering disoriented after 12 hours of failed attempts to find the exit. Her face was marked with exhaustion and fear as she explained that her friends remained trapped below. The emergency call went out immediately. First responders Duncan Adams and Kathy Wigand of Lewis and Clark Search and Rescue entered the cave, carrying professional equipment, which was far superior to what the teens had brought with them. From the top of the first drop, they called down into the depths and heard weak responses. The trapped teens' voices were hoarse from shouting and weakened by hunger, dehydration, and exposure to the cold. More rescuers arrived with proper equipment, rigging safety ropes and harnesses. One rescuer rappelled down to the stranded teens, finding them huddled together for warmth, surrounded by the burned pieces of their rope. Their faces were pale, their lips blue from cold. The discovery of their destroyed rope shocked even the experienced rescuers. It represented how completely panic had overwhelmed rational thinking. The rescue team established elaborate haul systems, complex mechanical arrangements of ropes and pulleys to safely extract the stranded teens. Each teenager was secured in a rescue harness, then painstakingly raised up the vertical shafts that had trapped them for 24 terrifying hours. Even with professional equipment, the extraction was challenging and potentially dangerous. After 4 intensive hours of rescue operations, the teens finally emerged from the cave entrance, squinting painfully in the daylight they had feared they might never see again. Medical personnel immediately wrapped them in thermal blankets to address their hypothermia. Their bodies shook uncontrollably, partly from cold, partly from the trauma of their ordeal. Medical evaluation revealed they had narrowly escaped more serious consequences. Another night in the cave could have resulted in severe hypothermia, possibly even death. The injured teens' wounds, though painful, had been partially preserved by the cold. All 3 showed signs of dehydration, exhaustion, and the psychological impacts of their prolonged exposure to darkness and fear. After medical clearance, the teenagers were released. Later, the teens admitted they had used this same unsafe climbing system once before in the cave. Their earlier success had made them overconfident. The rescue team hoped that the fear of their 24-hour ordeal, the slow suffering from cold, darkness, hunger, and fear, would teach them a powerful lesson about respecting the dangers of caves and the absolute need for proper equipment and training. It was the morning of August 17, 1997, when Eduardo Mendez loaded the last of the diving equipment into the van for the upcoming diving trip. For the 5 tourists, 3 Americans and 2 Canadians, this excursion from Cozumel to the Cenotes near Tulum represented the highlight of their Mexican vacation. For Eduardo, it was just another day guiding tourists through the Yucatan Peninsula. Eduardo had worked as an open water diving instructor for 3 years. At 28, he had accumulated hundreds of dives in the Caribbean waters around Cozumel, but his experience in cave and cavern diving was limited to the tourist routes he had memorized. He knew enough to impress his clients, but lacked the specialized training that cave diving demanded. The group departed at 7 a.m., taking the ferry from Cozumel to Playa del Carmen, then driving south to their first destination, Grand Cenote. The group prepped up before entering into the deep waters. Their first dive at Grand Cenote went smoothly. They explored the underwater cave system and then exited the cave without any problem. By early afternoon, the group arrived at their second destination, Cenote Temple of Doom, named for its dark, foreboding entrance and challenging dive conditions. Unlike the open and easy entrance of Grand Cenote, Temple of Doom presented as a small, dark hole in the jungle floor, approximately 3 meters, 10 feet in diameter. From here, a wooden ladder descended 5 meters, 16 feet, to the water's surface. The mood among the divers remained upbeat as they prepared for their second dive. Rebecca Williams, a 34-year-old nurse from Boston, helped her husband Mark check his equipment. Both were newly certified open water divers with only 12 dives in their logbooks, none in overhead environments. Thomas Chen, a 42-year-old software engineer from Vancouver, had slightly more experience with 30 dives, but was also new to Cenote diving. His wife Lisa, 39, had completed 22 dives. The 5th tourist, Joy Johnson, a 28-year-old teacher from Chicago with 20 dives logged, decided to sit out this dive, feeling fatigued from the morning's exertion. None of the divers possessed the specialized training, equipment, or experience necessary for cave diving. Their single tanks, minimal lighting, and lack of redundant systems would be adequate for open water or properly supervised cavern dives, but dangerously insufficient beyond that boundary. Eduardo conducted a briefing that emphasized the beauty they would encounter, but didn't focus much over the risks. He mentioned staying close and watching air consumption, but said nothing about the cave environment's specific dangers. The divers nodded eagerly, missing the significance of what wasn't said. One by one, entered the water. The cenote's surface was small, surrounded by limestone walls draped with tree roots and vines. Unlike Grand Cenote, sunlight barely penetrated here, creating an atmosphere of mystery that thrilled the tourists. They checked their regulators, adjusted their buoyancy compensators, and submerged into the dark waters. The initial descent revealed a halocline, the dramatic visual boundary where freshwater meets denser saltwater, at about 10 meters, 33 feet. Passing through this natural phenomenon created momentary visual distortion, adding to the otherworldly experience. Beyond, the cavern opened into a larger chamber. For 20 minutes, the group explored the cavern zone, remaining within sight of ambient light from the entrance. Then, Eduardo made a fateful decision. Rather than completing the dive within the relative safety of areas illuminated by natural light, he led them toward a restriction known as the Madonna Passage. 2 warning signs marked this boundary between the cavern and the true cave zone. The first, a simple underwater marker, displayed the universal symbol of a diver with a red slash through it. The second, more explicit, "Stop, prevent your death, go no further." Eduardo swam past these warnings without hesitation. His clients, trusting his judgment, followed. The Madonna Passage narrowed to approximately 1.5 meters, 5 feet wide, and 2 meters, 6.5 feet, high. The guideline, a thin nylon rope that served as the only reliable navigation reference, disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their lights. As they progressed, the light from the entrance vanished. They were now in a true cave environment, requiring specialized training, equipment, and protocols. After 10 minutes in the passage, the group had penetrated approximately 120 meters, 394 feet, from the entrance. Their single tanks, adequate for an open water dive of proper duration, were now depleting at an accelerated rate due to depth, exertion, and the anxiety that unconsciously accompanied overhead diving for the inexperienced. Thomas Chin was the first to signal a problem, tapping his pressure gauge to indicate diminishing air. Eduardo, finally recognizing the danger, signaled for the group to turn back. In the narrow confines of the passage, executing a proper turn with 5 divers created momentary confusion. The silt that had settled on the cave floor for centuries was disturbed by their fins, reducing visibility from meters to centimeters in seconds. Eduardo headed toward the exit, assuming the group was following. Rebecca and Mark Williams, however, became separated in the sudden darkness and silt cloud. Disoriented and unable to locate the guideline, they swam in what they believed was the direction of the exit, but was actually deeper into the complex system. Thomas and Lisa Chen, staying together but equally lost, moved in yet another direction. When Eduardo reached the cavern zone and turned to count his clients, he realized with horror that only he had emerged from the passage. Checking his pressure gauge, he saw his tank approaching reserve levels. He surfaced quickly, explained the situation to Joy, and swapped his nearly empty tank for her full one. Without waiting for additional help, he plunged back into the water. Following the guideline with practiced efficiency, Eduardo penetrated the passage again. Approximately 90 meters, 295 feet in, he encountered Lisa Chen, her regulator out of her mouth, desperately breathing from her husband, Thomas's octopus, backup regulator. Thomas's gauge showed near empty. Eduardo immediately shared his air source with Lisa and began guiding them out. Thomas, struggling but conscious, followed the guideline with one hand. Upon reaching the cavern zone, Eduardo sent the Chens to the surface and immediately returned to search for the Williams couple. 50 meters, 164 feet, into the passage, he found Rebecca Williams unconscious, her tank empty. He grabbed her and brought her to the surface, where Joy helped pull her onto the rocky shore and began resuscitation efforts. As for the Chens, while they were surfacing, low air and panic caused them disorientation. They were trying to figure their way out, and in all the confusion and chaos, the couple got separated. Thomas was on the right path, so he decided to surface and get help to save his wife and someone to assist Eduardo in finding the missing diver. Lisa, panicked and on borrowed time, decided to return back into the cave, maybe in hopes of finding Eduardo, so that he can get her out of this horrific nightmare. Eduardo, on the other hand, continued his desperate search, eventually led him to Mark Williams. He looked around and was in a complete state of shock to find Lisa just a few meters behind. It was apparent that she had become separated from her husband during the exit and turned back. Both, Lisa and Williams, were floating motionless, their tanks empty, regulators still in their mouths. There was nothing to be done for them. By the time emergency services arrived, Rebecca Williams had been transported to the nearest hospital in Tulum. Despite medical intervention, she succumbed to the effects of drowning and oxygen deprivation later that evening. The bodies of Mark Williams and Lisa Chen were recovered by specialized cave divers from the local rescue service. The official investigation cited multiple factors in the tragedy. The guide's decision to enter a cave environment with inadequately trained and equipped divers, ignoring explicit warning signs, poor gas management, and lack of proper emergency procedures. For the cave diving community, it represented yet another preventable accident in a long history of similar tragedies in the Yucatan cenotes. The signs warning divers at the entrance to the Madonna Passage remain in place today. October 7, 2022, began as an ordinary day in the Black Hills of South Dakota. 3 cave explorers prepared their equipment at the unmarked entrance of Mystic Cave, a relatively unknown system situated on private property. Mark Jennings, a veteran, standing 6'2" with a lean frame built from years of climbing and squeezing through tight spaces, checked his helmet light, batteries, and survey tools. His companions, both experienced themselves, packed small bags with water, energy bars, and additional survey equipment. Today's mission focused on exploring and mapping a newly discovered lead at the deepest section of the cave. The 3 entered Mystic Cave at 9:15 a.m. The entrance section offered comfortable walking space with ceilings high enough to stand upright, but this luxury gradually disappeared as they ventured deeper. Soon they were navigating a series of progressively smaller crawlways, their bodies pressed against the floor. 40 minutes into their journey, the team reached what had previously been considered the end of the explorable cave, a modest chamber where the ceiling hung just low enough to force a perpetual stoop. In the farthest corner, barely visible unless specifically searching for it, a small opening marked the site of recent excavation work. Several preceding trips had focused on widening this promising lead, creating a hole just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond this point lay unmapped territory. Mark volunteered to investigate first. Despite his height presenting obvious challenges for tight cave passages, he had developed techniques over the years to navigate restrictions that seemed physically impossible. He approached the opening with measured confidence, studying the dimensions with his headlamp before removing his helmet and placing it on the ground beside him. The passage ahead appeared incredibly tight, perhaps 9 or 10 inches in height, with an immediate right-hand turn visible just a few feet in. Lying flat on his stomach, Mark pushed his helmet ahead into the passage and began the methodical process of compression. First his arms extended forward, then his head entered the space, followed by the careful working of his shoulders through the opening. The cold rock pressed against him from above and below, immediately sapping body heat through direct contact. The passage allowed no room for raising his head. He could only look forward by craning his neck slightly, creating immediate discomfort. 6 feet into the passage, Mark encountered the first significant obstacle, a sharp 90-degree bend to the right. The turn required complex body manipulation to navigate. He extended his right arm fully around the corner, while twisting his torso to align his shoulders with the bend. Each movement resulted in clothing dragging against rock, creating resistance that had to be overcome with pure muscular effort. His breathing became more measured, controlled to manage both the physical exertion and the psychological weight of the stone pressing from all sides. After maneuvering through the first bend, Mark could see the passage take another sharp turn, this time to the left, creating the S-shaped configuration that would prove so problematic. With determination, he continued forward, contorting his body to match the cave's demands. The second bend presented even greater difficulty. Mark removed his boots, pushing them ahead to gain the precious extra inches needed to make the turn. The rock scraped against his sock-covered feet as he inched forward. Beyond the S-bend, the passage unexpectedly angled steeply upward into a small chamber just large enough to sit in. This discovery brought momentary relief. He had found new passage, potentially significant for their mapping project. Mark took a moment to catch his breath in this relative spaciousness before considering his exit. He would need to descend the slope head first and navigate back through the S-bend in reverse. The trouble began when Mark positioned himself for the return journey. Descending the slope head first, he reached the first bend and immediately sensed something was wrong. The angle of approach from this direction was significantly more awkward. Where his body had naturally folded around the corners on the way in, it now resisted the unnatural contortions required for exit. His legs in particular could not make the sharp turns his upper body had managed earlier. The first real flash of concern came 15 minutes into his exit attempt. Despite repeated efforts with different body positions, Mark could not work his lower body through the second bend of the S-turn. Each failed attempt consumed energy and increased his heart rate, causing faster breathing in the confined space. The passage seemed to have grown smaller, though rationally, he knew this was impossible. The psychological effect of confinement began its insidious work on his mind. Mark's companions, waiting at the small chamber beyond the dig, grew concerned at the lack of progress. They could barely reach his outstretched hands. Together, they attempted to pull him forward while he pushed with his legs, but the angles worked against them. After an hour of fruitless efforts, the reality of the situation became clear. Mark was thoroughly stuck, unable to move more than 2 feet in either direction. His position was particularly troubling, flat on his stomach, arms extended forward, legs stretched behind, with his torso twisted to accommodate the first bend of the S-turn. The complete immobility triggered waves of primal fear that required constant mental management to suppress. The temperature of the cave, initially refreshing after physical exertion, now posed a serious threat. With Mark's body in direct contact with the limestone floor and ceiling, and no ability to move to generate heat, hypothermia became a real concern. 2 hours into the entrapment, Mark's companions made the difficult decision to seek help. One would remain with Mark, while the other would navigate the 40-minute journey back to the surface and call for rescue. The prospect of extended time in this position sent a wave of dread through Mark's body that was worse than the physical discomfort. Time stretched in the darkness. Minutes expanded to feel like hours. Mark focused on controlling his breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations, to conserve energy and manage the growing anxiety. 4 hours into the ordeal, the first signs of rescue arrived in the form of local caving experts from the Pahasapa Grotto, several with specialized training in cave rescue. They brought essential supplies, communications wire to establish contact with the surface, food, water, heat packs, and most importantly, tools to modify the passage. The rescue presented immediate challenges. Even the smallest rescuer could barely reach Mark's head and one hand. The technical aspects of the rescue proved equally challenging. The hammer drill, their primary tool for passage modification, could only be operated from awkward positions, limiting its effectiveness. Each attempt at rock removal yielded small victories measured in fractions of inches. After each modification, rescuers would attempt extraction by rigging webbing around Mark's wrists and pulling while he pushed with his legs. Each failure compounded the mental toll of the entrapment. Hour 10 brought a crisis point. The combination of cold, dehydration, and psychological stress triggered uncontrollable shivering in Mark's body. The involuntary movements caused additional abrasions as his body scraped against the rock. The pain intensified, particularly in his hips and shoulders, where pressure points had developed into deep bruising. The rescuers recognized the signs of advancing hypothermia and worked with renewed urgency, passing additional heat packs and covering what portions of his body they could reach with emergency blankets. Throughout the night, the drilling continued in shifts. The noise reverberated painfully in the confined space, and rock dust filled the air, irritating Mark's eyes and lungs. Yet, each small chunk of removed limestone represented progress toward freedom. By hour 15, enough material had been removed from the critical corner that Mark could pull his knees up slightly, changing his position for the first time in over half a day. This small victory provided renewed determination to endure. At 5:45 a.m. on October 8th, after 18 hours of complete immobility, the final extraction attempt succeeded. As rescuers pulled on the webbing secured around Mark's wrists, he felt his body finally slide forward through the modified S-bend. The sensation of movement after such prolonged stillness sent waves of pain through muscles that had been compressed against stone for hours. Freedom came not with immediate relief, but with a new kind of agony as blood flowed into cramped tissues and damaged skin, pulled against rock one final time. In the small chamber beyond the restriction, rescuers immediately wrapped Mark in emergency blankets and provided warm fluids. Despite 18 hours of torture, the journey out took twice the normal time. When Mark finally emerged into the early morning sunlight, the experience had permanently altered his relationship with confined spaces. What had previously been challenging passages to overcome were now potential traps to be evaluated with newfound respect. August 23rd, 2003. Three friends gathered at the entrance to Rubidoux Spring Cave, located in Missouri. Steven Weybracht, a 50-year-old diving enthusiast, checked his equipment one last time alongside his companions, Ron Shirley and John Davis. The trio had planned this expedition for weeks, excited to explore the famous Big Room that lay hidden deep within the underwater cave system. Each man wore specialized diving certificates clipped to their gear bags, proof that they met the strict access requirements for this challenging cave dive. Rubidoux Spring Cave wasn't for beginners. Its winding passages extended far beneath the earth, with the Big Room located approximately 1,400 feet, about 427 meters, from the entrance and sitting at a depth of 165 feet, 50 meters below the surface. This was serious cave diving that required proper planning, equipment, and experience. The three friends had mapped out their adventure carefully. They would enter using special breathing mixtures designed for deep diving, travel through the underwater tunnels using underwater propulsion devices called scooters, reach the Big Room to admire its hidden wonders, and then return safely to the surface. The dive would require several stops along the way to safely adjust to changing pressures, a process divers call decompression. Steven, Ron, and John suited up methodically. Each diver wore a dry suit to protect against the cave's chilly waters, which hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. Unlike regular wetsuits, dry suits kept divers completely dry, with only their faces exposed to the water. Beneath their suits, they wore insulating layers to trap body heat during the long dive ahead. Their equipment was extensive and specialized for cave exploration. Each carried double tanks filled with Tri-Mix, a special blend of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium strapped to their backs. They also carried additional stage bottles, one filled with Tri-Mix and another with nitrox, a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. These extra tanks would be used at different phases of the dive, ensuring they had the right breathing gas for each depth and activity. The most exciting addition to their gear was the underwater scooters. These handheld devices would pull them through the water, conserving their energy and air supply. For Steven, this would be his first time using such a device on a dive, an exciting new experience to add to his underwater adventures. As they entered the water, the surface rippled and then settled. The natural spring pool at the cave entrance was crystal clear, reflecting the blue sky above. But they knew that clarity wouldn't last once they ventured deeper into the cave system, where stirred-up silt could quickly reduce visibility to near zero. Their plan was well structured. First, they would breathe from their nitrox tanks while traveling to a room called the Drop-Off, located about 350 feet, 107 meters, into the cave at a depth of 50 feet, 15 meters. At this important waypoint, the cave floor suddenly plunged downward from 50 feet to about 135 feet, 41 meters, leading to the lower tunnel system. Here, they would leave their nitrox tanks for later use during their return journey. After switching to their Tri-Mix travel tanks, they would power up their scooters and zoom through the lower tunnel, a passage known as Witchaway Avenue, traveling approximately 1,100 feet, 335 meters, to reach the Big Room. This tunnel averaged about 150 feet, 46 meters deep, and was relatively low, with just 4.5 feet, 1.4 meters of clearance in many places. The three divers slipped beneath the surface and descended into the underwater world. They attached themselves to the permanent guideline, a safety rope that begins in the cavern zone, about 75 feet, 23 meters from the entrance. This guideline would be their pathway both in and out, a critical lifeline in case visibility deteriorated. With a gentle hum, they activated their scooters. The devices pulled them effortlessly through the upper tunnel. The beams from their powerful underwater lights cut through the darkness, revealing the cave's fascinating features. Limestone formations that had formed over thousands of years lined the walls, creating an alien landscape of mineral deposits shaped by water over countless centuries. After traveling about 350 feet through the upper passage at a depth of 45 feet, 14 meters, they reached the drop-off. Here, as planned, each diver carefully placed a tank at 70 feet, 21 meters depth for their return journey. They would need these tanks later for their carefully calculated decompression stops. The three friends then continued their descent into the lower tunnel of Witchaway Avenue. The passage narrowed somewhat as they traveled deeper, with the ceiling occasionally dipping low enough that they needed to duck their heads. Their lights revealed fascinating rock formations and occasional glimpses of the unique wildlife that had adapted to this lightless world. Unknown to Ron and John, Stephen was experiencing his first problem. His stage bottle was emptying faster than expected, perhaps due to the extra air needed as he learned to handle the unfamiliar scooter, or possibly because of an equipment issue. Without alerting his companions, Stephen switched to his back-mounted tanks earlier than planned, but continued forward with the group toward their destination. The big room finally came into view, its vastness a stark contrast to the narrow tunnel they had navigated. Even their powerful lights couldn't reach all corners of this underwater chamber. The three divers paused to take in the magnificent sight. Few humans had ever laid eyes on this remote underground wonder. After a brief exploration, mindful of their air supplies and the long journey back, they signaled to each other that it was time to turn around. As they began their return journey through Witchaway Avenue, Stephen checked the pressure gauge on his tanks. The needle pointed to a dangerously low reading of just 500 psi, far less air than he should have had at this point in the dive. A properly filled scuba tank typically starts with around 3,000 psi, 207 bar, so Stephen had used nearly 85% of his air supply. Realizing the seriousness of his situation, Stephen signaled to Ron, showing him the gauge. Ron immediately offered his extra regulator, a safety backup attached to a long hose designed specifically for air-sharing emergencies. This quick action exemplified the safety protocols that experienced cave divers follow. Now, breathing from Ron's tank through the extra-long hose, Stephen continued swimming alongside his friend. However, new problems emerged. Stephen struggled to control his buoyancy, the ability to float at a consistent depth underwater. He would rise too high and then sink too low, making forward progress difficult. John, unaware of these developing problems, continued ahead of them. Despite the challenges, Stephen and Ron reached the end of the lower tunnel at a depth of 135 feet, 41 meters, and began their ascent up the drop-off. As they rose above 100 feet, 30 meters, Stephen's buoyancy problems worsened. He floated upward faster than Ron, eventually reaching the limit of the long hose connecting him to Ron's air supply. The regulator was pulled from Stephen's mouth. In the dim light, Stephen swam back down to Ron and took Ron's backup regulator. After taking a few breaths, Stephen gave Ron the OK hand signal that divers use to communicate underwater. Meanwhile, Ron tried to locate his primary long hose regulator that had been pulled away. When he looked up again, Stephen was nowhere to be seen. The activity had stirred up silt from the cave floor, drastically reducing visibility. Ron continued his ascent to the 70-foot, 21-meter decompression stop, where they had left their bottles earlier. John had already retrieved his bottle and moved on, but Stephen's bottle remained alongside Ron's. Seeing no sign of his friend and growing increasingly concerned, Ron collected his decompression bottle and continued toward the cave entrance, hoping that Stephen had perhaps sought help from another group of divers he had glimpsed passing through the area. Upon reaching the surface, Ron emerged from the water with urgent news. Stephen was missing. Immediate action was taken to find him. Rescue divers quickly entered the cave and, tragically, discovered Stephen's body floating near the ceiling of the cave in the area where Ron had last seen him. All three of his tanks were empty, and the exhaust valve on his dry suit was completely closed, a critical detail that explained his struggles with buoyancy. The day that had begun with such excitement and promise had ended in tragedy. Later, analysis would reveal a series of small problems that had cascaded into disaster. Stephen's regulator might have been set too sensitively, potentially allowing air to leak unnoticed. The unfamiliar noise of his scooter might have masked the sound of escaping air. The closed exhaust valve on his dry suit had prevented him from properly controlling his buoyancy. Most importantly, there had been miscommunication between the three divers about the severity of Stephen's situation. This unfortunate event highlighted the unforgiving nature of underwater cave exploration. Even experienced certified divers for those who continue to explore such environments, Stephen's experience underscores the importance of strict adherence to safety protocols, clear communication, equipment familiarity, and the willingness to abort a dive at the first sign of trouble. May 25th, 2003, dawned clear and bright, perfect for the outdoor adventure Chris Molyneux had planned for his family. At 36, Chris considered himself an experienced caver, having visited several of Washington's lava tubes over the years. His previous expedition to Ape Cave with his older children had sparked their enthusiasm for underground exploration. And today, he intended to satisfy their curiosity with a visit to Ice Rink Cave. The night before, Chris had carefully programmed his GPS with coordinates he'd obtained from a caving forum. He'd studied the cave map, noting the multiple entrances and the distinctive ice formation that gave the cave its name. The expedition seemed perfect for a family outing. A short hike from the parking area, a brief underground adventure, and back home in time for dinner. The Molyneux family minivan bumped along the Forest Service road, climbing steadily into the mountains. His wife Michelle sat quietly in the passenger seat, while their three children, ages 7, 4, and 18 months, chattered excitedly in the back. Chris parked about 200 yards from where his GPS indicated the cave entrance should be. He unloaded their minimal gear, hoisted the baby carrier onto Michelle's back, and led his family along a faint trail through the pine forest. They soon came upon a depression in the ground with a dark opening, a sinkhole entrance to what Chris presumed was Ice Rink Cave. Studying the opening and comparing it to his map, uncertainty crept in. The map indicated several entrances, and he couldn't be certain which one they had found. Nevertheless, the day was perfect, the children were eager, and Chris felt confident in his abilities. He strapped on his helmet, clicked on his headlamp, and secured his fanny pack containing 2 backup lights, spare batteries, and the folded cave map. Without conscious thought, he slipped the car keys into his pocket. Chris decided to scout ahead alone, planning to verify the route before bringing his family inside. He would check whether this passage connected to the main chamber with its namesake ice formation. The entrance passage narrowed as Chris descended, the temperature dropping noticeably with each step. After approximately 100 feet, he encountered what appeared to be a dead end, with only a small 18-inch high crawlway continuing to the right. Unfolding his map in the beam of his headlamp, he studied the layout. The configuration seemed to match a section near the west entrance. If his orientation was correct, he could navigate through the crawl, travel a short distance through the main passage, and emerge at the larger entrance featuring the ice deposit, a perfect loop for the family to explore. Chris dropped to his hands and knees and squeezed through the tight opening, pushing his fanny pack ahead of him. Emerging on the other side, he found himself in a larger passage extending both left and right. According to his understanding of the map, the main entrance should lie to the left. He turned in that direction and proceeded confidently, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the absolute darkness. The minutes stretched as he walked, the passage extending farther than anticipated. After some time, he encountered a section of breakdown, collapsed ceiling, and tumbled boulders that wasn't indicated on his map. Confusion flickered across his mind, but he reasoned that perhaps the map was outdated or simplified. He carefully picked his way through the obstacles, convinced the main entrance must lie just ahead. Finally, Chris arrived at what appeared to be a collapsed entrance, completely plugged with dirt and debris. No light penetrated the fill. Standing before this unexpected barrier, a cold sensation spread between his shoulder blades. This didn't match the map at all. Checking his watch, he realized he'd been gone much longer than the quick reconnaissance he'd promised Michelle. Chris turned back, retracing his steps through the breakdown section. His pace quickened as concern for his waiting family grew. After walking for what seemed longer than his inbound journey, he arrived at another apparent collapsed entrance. It looked strikingly similar to the one he'd just left. Disorientation washed over him as he tried to reconcile this impossibility with his mental map. To confirm his suspicion, Chris bent down and scratched a large X in the dirt with his finger. Heart pounding, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, counting his steps. Approximately 400 paces later, his headlamp illuminated the same X marked in the dirt. A wave of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him as the reality of his situation crystallized. He was trapped in a circular passage with no obvious exit. The crawlway had to be here somewhere. It couldn't have simply vanished. Chris forced himself to calm his accelerating heartbeat and think rationally. He decided to systematically search the outer wall of the loop, running his hand along the cool rock surface. As he walked, awareness of time's passage intensified his anxiety. He'd been underground for over an hour now. Michelle would be frantic. The weight of the car keys in his pocket suddenly felt like an anchor. His family was effectively stranded at the trailhead with no transportation, no way to seek help without abandoning the children or forcing them on a long hike. His methodical search of the outer wall yielded nothing. No crawlway, no escape route. Chris completed another circuit, this time examining the inner wall with equal attention. Still nothing. The beam of his headlamp seemed to dim, though he knew he had fresh batteries. The darkness pressed closer, almost tangible in its oppression. Trying to maintain order in his search, Chris tore small pieces from his cave map and placed them at distinctive features along the loop. Breakdown piles, unusual formations, the collapsed entrance. After his third complete circuit, finding himself once again at his starting point with no sign of the crawlway, the first tendrils of genuine panic took root in his chest. His breathing became shallow and rapid, sweat dampening his shirt despite the cave's chill. 5 hours had passed. 5 hours of circling in the darkness, each circuit feeding his growing disorientation. Chris no longer knew exactly what he was looking for. The cramped opening had grown mythical in his mind, a portal that might have never existed. Each rock, each contour of the wall started to look identical, features blending together in the narrow cone of his headlamp beam. Exhaustion began to take its toll. Chris sat heavily on a boulder, his mind replaying the moment he had entered the crawlway. Had he actually turned left after emerging, or right? His certainty wavered. Perhaps his fundamental assumptions were wrong. Another hour passed as Chris made additional circuits, each more desperate than the last. The cave seemed to shift around him, passages stretching and contracting in his perception. The absolute darkness beyond his light beam felt alive, watching, waiting for his light to fail. His throat constricted with thirst. The silence pressed against his eardrums, broken only by his footsteps and increasingly ragged breathing. A new terrible thought emerged, that this was no ordinary cave. Stories of cavers lost forever in mountain tunnels surfaced from his memory. Perhaps this place had claimed others before him, trapping them in its circular passage until their lights failed and the darkness consumed them. Chris's legs trembled as he stood for another circuit. He had been underground for nearly 6 hours now, circumnavigating the loop perhaps a dozen times. He tried calling out, knowing the futility. The entrance was too far away, the earthen walls too effective at swallowing sound. His voice echoed briefly then died, emphasizing his isolation. Suddenly, something inside Chris snapped. The weight of his situation crashed down upon him all at once. His composure shattered like glass. Chris fell to his knees, the damp cave floor soaking through his pants. His body shook with sobs that wrenched themselves from deep in his chest. The beam of his headlamp danced wildly across the walls as his shoulders heaved. "Please," he begged the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Please, I need to get out. My family needs me." His fingers clawed at the dirt floor, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. Time stretched meaninglessly in the darkness. Minutes or hours might have passed as Chris knelt there, his reserves of hope draining away. The faces of his children flashed before his mind's eye, their excitement this morning, their trust in him. The thought that he might never see them again was unbearable. Then, from some deep reserve, a flicker of determination kindled. His children were waiting. Michelle would be terrified. He was their father, their protector, the man who promised adventure and safety in equal measure. They needed him to find his way back. In desperation, Chris returned to the collapsed entrance and began again, this time staying low to the ground, examining every inch of wall near floor level. 50 feet from the dirt plug, he paused. Something about the shadow pattern seemed different. He crouched lower, directing his beam along the base of the wall. There it was, an opening barely 18 inches high, partially obscured by a protruding rock. Relief surged through him, immediately followed by disbelief at his blindness. The crawlway had been here all along, just 50 feet, 15 meters, from the collapsed entrance. Chris realized his critical error. Upon entering the cave and emerging from the crawl, he had indeed turned left, as he recalled. But he had then walked almost the entire loop before encountering the collapsed entrance. Not recognizing this, he had formed the mistaken impression that the crawl must be on the opposite side of the loop. He dropped to his knees and scrambled through the opening, overwhelmed by relief as he recognized the initial passage. Minutes later, he emerged into the golden afternoon sunlight, blinking painfully as his eyes adjusted. The forest seemed impossibly vibrant after the monochromatic darkness of the cave. The parking area stood empty. Michelle and the children were gone. Chris stood alone in the mountain silence, the weight of his error pressing down on him. Only later would he learn that Michelle, growing increasingly concerned, had taken the children and hiked back to the road, eventually hitching a ride to a Forest Service station, where she had requested assistance. She had returned with help just as Chris emerged from his underground prison, ending his 5-hour ordeal in Minotaur Cave, a name the formation would receive following the incident that nearly made it his tomb. It was July 10th, 2005. The sun blazed over the arid landscape of San Luis Potosí as 5 friends loaded the last of their supplies into the bed of Javier's pickup truck. Miguel, the self-proclaimed leader of their expedition, tossed in a cooler packed with beer and tequila. Carlos, Alejandro, Emilio, and Daniel followed suit with their camping gear, none of which included proper caving equipment. None of them had bothered to research the terrain they were heading into. The trip had been hastily planned after Miguel had seen photos of the underground raves held near Cueva de los Caballos on social media. The group had never been caving before. What they knew about proper caving procedures could have fit on a bottle cap. They had no helmets, no proper lighting equipment beyond their phone flashlights, no emergency supplies, and no understanding of the karst topography that characterized the region. What they did bring was alcohol, cases of it, along with a portable speaker and recreational substances that would further impair their judgment. They arrived at the makeshift campsite in the late afternoon. Other vehicles were already parked haphazardly across the clearing, their owners having arrived earlier for the underground rave that was to take place that night. The friends set up their campsite. They cracked open beers before their tents were even fully secured. Meteorological forecasts had predicted heavy rain, but none of them had checked the weather report before departing. They made their way toward the cave entrance, following the sound of music without a trail map or guide. The path was already muddy from light rain earlier in the day, but they paid it no mind, slipping occasionally and laughing it off. They had each consumed several beers at this point, and Daniel had already twisted his ankle after tripping over an exposed root, though he dismissed it as nothing serious with a wave of his hand and another swig from his bottle. The rave was in full swing when they arrived. Hundreds of young people danced in and around the mouth of Cueva de los Caballos. For hours, the 5 friends danced, drank, and partied with reckless abandon. They ventured deeper into the cave than the organizers had intended, ignoring the few "do not enter" signs that had been half-heartedly posted. As midnight approached, the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, quickly turning the ground outside the cave slippery. The rave continued, but Miguel, now heavily intoxicated, decided he wanted to retrieve more alcohol from their campsite. Despite evident concern from the others about the weather, his compromised state, and the darkness, he insisted on going alone. Alejandro, only slightly less intoxicated, ultimately decided to accompany him, grabbing a sack to carry back more beer. The 2 young men stumbled out into the rain. Neither had thought to bring a flashlight or headlamp. Their phone batteries had died hours ago from taking videos and photos of the rave. The only illumination came from the occasional flash of lightning, which cast brief, ghostly shadows across the landscape before plunging them back into absolute darkness. Miguel walked ahead, carrying the empty sack that would soon be filled with bottles. His intoxication had given him false confidence, a dangerous bravado that made him blind to the peril surrounding them. Alejandro followed a few paces behind, his movements increasingly uncoordinated as he struggled against the mud pulling at his shoes. A sudden gust of wind brought with it a heavier sheet of rain. Miguel quickened his pace, but then somehow, he strayed from the path in his impaired state. The ground ahead seemed solid as he took a glimpse during a lightning flash, and he stepped forward confidently. However, he was gravely mistaken. The sound of breaking glass pierced the night as Miguel's foot found not solid ground, but empty air. The sack containing several beer bottles shattered against the rock wall as his body plummeted into the darkness of Cenote de. His scream was brief, cut short by impact after impact as he hit each level of the deadly pit. First the 79 feet, 24-meter initial drop, then tumbling down a steep 20 feet, 6-meter slope. The slope's end was followed by another drop of 62 feet, 19 meters. He had a hard fall and his body struck the ground with an immense force. Alejandro froze in terror. The sound of glass breaking and Miguel's abrupt cry had sobered him instantly. He called out, but no response came. Terrified and disoriented, he stumbled backward, now acutely aware of the invisible dangers surrounding him. Through some miracle of self-preservation, Alejandro managed to retrace his steps to the cave entrance. He explained to everyone what had happened. Everyone scattered in confusion. Carlos, Emilio, and Daniel, upon hearing of Miguel's fall, rushed out into the rain, despite their intoxication, desperate to find their friend. The local authorities were contacted by one of the few sober attendees who had cell service. Rescue teams specialized in cave exploration rushed to the site. They arrived at dawn, by which time the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The 4 remaining friends, now painfully sober, led the rescue team to the approximate location of Miguel's disappearance. The cave rescuers, professionals with proper equipment and training, methodically searched the area. They quickly identified the entrance to Cenote de, a geological feature well known to them, but entirely unknown to the group of friends who had treated this dangerous terrain as a playground. The rescuers rigged safety lines and descended down with proper lighting, safety gear, and communication equipment, all the precautions that Miguel and his friends had neglected. At the bottom of the pit, amid shards of broken glass that had once been beer bottles, they found Miguel's body. The fall had been unsurvivable. His head had suffered catastrophic trauma from the multiple impacts. The medical examiner would later determine that death had been instantaneous after the first major impact, a small mercy in an otherwise senseless tragedy. News of the death spread quickly through the community of cave explorers. For them, the story was a familiar one, another preventable fatality caused by a lethal combination of ignorance, impairment, and disrespect for the unforgiving nature of underground environments. The local authorities closed access to the cave system pending an investigation, though everyone involved knew that the cause was clear. Miguel had died not because the cave was inherently deadly, but because he and his friends had approached it with a deadly lack of respect and preparation. The 4 surviving friends faced the consequences of their poor decisions. They had sought fun with alcohol instead of knowledge and proper equipment. They had ignored basic safety rules taught to every beginner. Never explore alone, always bring proper lights, know the terrain, and never drink or use drugs while caving. As rescue workers carried Miguel's body out, the survivors realized how foolish they had been. The beer at their campsite, the speakers, their casual attitude, all seemed meaningless now. Their weekend trip had ended with a death that could have been prevented. In the weeks that followed, signs would be posted around Cueva de los Caballos and Sótano de, warning visitors of the dangers. The underground raves would be banned, at least officially. But for those who understood the unforgiving nature of caves, no sign could adequately convey the simple truth that had cost Miguel his life. That the earth beneath our feet contains wonders worthy of exploration, but only by those who approach them with the knowledge, equipment, and sobriety that such dangerous beauty demands. It was October 31st, 2004 when Saraos Jimenez prepared for the hunt. Jimenez sharpened his machete with practiced strokes while his sons, Pascual and Miguel, watched. At 11, Pascual had joined his father on several hunts before. 6-year-old Miguel, however, could barely contain his excitement. This would be his first real hunt. The family needed meat. The harvest had been meager, and the village of Yoquib had seen harder times than usual. Tefes cuintles, the large rodents known elsewhere as pacas, were prized for their tender meat. These animals often took shelter in the limestone caves and surrounding mountains. One such cave system lay just beyond the Milpa. The cave was known to the locals simply as La Cueva, its multiple entrances creating perfect conditions for trapping animals. Jimenez's plan followed a hunting method used for generations. The boys would enter through the larger entrance, making noise to drive any sheltering animals toward the second exit, where Jimenez would wait with his machete. They had no flashlights, luxuries unavailable to the subsistence farmers of Yochib, only pine torches that would burn briefly. As the sun began its descent, the family set out. The main entrance measured about 1.5 meters, 5 feet high, draped with roots and vines. Jimenez gave his final instructions: make noise, move toward the light from the second entrance, and stay together. He would circle around to the smaller exit and wait. 20 minutes, no more. Then they would return home, hopefully with meat for their table. The boys entered the darkness as Jimenez disappeared into the brush. The cave narrowed quickly, forcing even the small children to crouch. The main chamber opened before them, approximately 6 meters, 20 feet, across at its widest point. The ceiling rose to about 3 meters, 10 feet. On the far side, a faint glow indicated the second entrance where their father waited. The boys began to clap and shout according to what they had planned. A movement caught their attention: the distinctive shape of a Tepizcuintli darting along the chamber's edge. The animal, weighing perhaps 10 kilograms, 22 pounds, was heading toward the second entrance, exactly as planned. The boys followed, their shouts intensifying. Outside, Jimenez heard the commotion. He gripped his machete tighter, eyes straining in the fading light. The Tepezcuintli burst from the smaller entrance, and Jimenez swung. The blade connected, but not cleanly. The wounded animal squealed in pain and rushed back into the cave. Cursing his missed opportunity, Jimenez called to his sons. He explained that he had wounded the animal and that it had retreated back inside. Such a prize could not be lost. Wounded game must be tracked and killed, both for the meat and mercy for the animal. Miguel, eager to prove himself, volunteered to go after the wounded Tepezcuintli. Before Jimenez could fully consider it to be a safe bet, the 6-year-old ran back into the cave. Pascual remained with his father, both assuming Miguel would quickly return back. Minutes passed. The blood trail led Miguel deeper into the cave beyond the main chamber. The wounded animal, operating on instinct, had sought the deepest shelter available. The Tepezcuintli, cornered and desperate, had squeezed into a side passage barely 0.6 meters, 2 feet. Miguel, unbothered by the dangers within cave systems, went after the animal. When Miguel did not emerge, concern grew. Jimenez sent Pascual to find his brother, lighting a fresh torch for him. The light was fading fast outside, and Jimenez's worry deepened with each passing minute. Pascual entered the cave, calling Miguel's name. He followed the main chamber to its rear, where he discovered the small side passage. Miguel's footprints were visible in the soft earth, leading into the crawl space. Pascual lowered himself to his hands and knees and entered the passage. After about 3 meters, 10 feet, the ceiling dropped further, forcing him to army crawl on his belly. After 6 meters, 20 feet, he heard Miguel's voice. The passage twisted left, then right. It was a 90-degree bend that descended steadily. To rescue his brother and get him to safety, Pascual went deeper inside, following the trail of the young Miguel's voice. More time passed, neither boy returned. Night fell completely. Jimenez entered the cave, navigating by memory to the main chamber. His calls came back unanswered. Eventually, he discovered a small side passage where fresh footprints led into darkness. Jimenez's broad shoulders prevented him from entering more than a meter into the narrow crawl space. His desperate calls received faint responses from deep within, but he could not reach his sons physically. Jimenez ran back to Yochib, rousing neighbors and family. By midnight, a dozen men with torches had gathered at the cave. They took turns trying to enter the side passage, but none could fit past the first sharp turn. They could hear the boys' voices, weak but present, somewhere deep in the tunnel. The smaller passage was impossibly tight for adult rescuers. They 2 young boys were very deep inside the cave, and perhaps one of them was stuck. They speculated it was most likely Miguel. No one knew exactly how deep this passage went, and how narrow it was. The events that followed would reveal the terrifyingly complicated situation they were dealing with. The first 24 hours passed in desperate, futile attempts to reach the children. Men dug with bare hands at the entrance of the passage, widening it inch by painstaking inch. Women from the village brought food for the rescuers. Jimenez refused to eat or sleep, his eyes fixed on the small opening that had swallowed his sons. By the second day, Word had spread to neighboring villages. More people arrived, bringing tools, picks, shovels, chisels. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the hours ticked by. Occasional sounds from deep in the passage confirmed the boys were still alive, but no one could reach them. Rescuers passed water in bamboo tubes, hoping some would reach the children. Inside the narrow passage, time lost meaning for the boys. Hunger, thirst, bone-chilling cold, and the oppressive darkness within confined walls. Facing this nightmare at the tender age of 6 and 11 left them traumatized. They could barely respond to the calls. The second day brought more rescuers and mounting anxiety. News had reached the municipal authorities, and officials arrived with more sophisticated tools. They brought battery-powered lamps and a small gasoline generator to power electric drills. The work continued around the clock. Time passed on, but the progress seemed slow. A perimeter formed around the cave entrance as more villagers arrived. Some came to help, others simply to watch. Tensions rose between family members who wanted to dig faster and rescue experts who insisted on caution. Arguments broke out. A man from a neighboring village accused the authorities of not doing enough. Jimenez stood silent through it all, exhausted yet hoping for a miracle. By the third day, rescuers had widened the passage enough and were able to penetrate about 6 meters, 20 feet, to the section that had a 90-degree bend. The passage narrowed further, and from there it was only wide enough for a small woman rescuer to squeeze through the bend. The woman rescuer, barely 45 kilograms, 100 pounds, and 1.5 meters, 5 feet, tall, navigated the tight passage with a small light strapped to her head, pushing a water bottle and some food ahead of her. She went deep inside the passage and covered around 4.7 meters, 15 feet. Further, however, to her surprise, she discovered a second sharp bend and constriction. Beyond it, she reported she could hear the boys clearly. The passage narrowed too severely for her to continue, but she could pass water and food through the narrow gap. When she emerged from the passage, her clothes torn and dirty, she reported that the boys were alive, but trapped beyond a series of tight bends and constrictions. This news energized the rescue effort. More people arrived with tools. Local officials called for additional help from the state government. A medical team set up a station near the cave entrance, preparing for the boys' eventual rescue. Jimenez finally accepted some water and tortillas, needing strength for the moment his sons would be freed. However, little did everyone know that things would take a dreadful turn. As the third day turned to night, the situation went from bad to worse. Storm clouds gathered over the mountains of Chiapas. October's dry spell was ending. The rain began that evening, increasing to a steady downpour. By midnight, water was flowing across the landscape, seeking the lowest points, including the cave entrances. Rescuers noticed the water first at their feet, a gentle stream that grew steadily stronger. They worked faster, desperation driving their efforts. They had widened the passage considerably, clearing the first constriction to a more manageable size. But they still had at least another 4.7 meters, 15 feet, and more to go, including the most difficult constrictions. The sound of running water soon drowned out all other noise. Men shouted warnings as the stream swelled. Some rescuers closest to the entrance were forced back by the rising flood. Jimenez fought to reach the passage. Certain death awaited his sons if the water continued to rise. Other men and the rescue teams tried to divert the stream with hastily built barriers of earth and stone. The plan was to stop the flow of water inside the cave by any means possible, setting up barriers after barriers, digging and carving a path for the water to flow in the opposite direction, anything that could prevent the cave from flooding. Unfortunately, their efforts proved futile against the force of nature. Water poured into the cave at an alarming rate, filling up all the passages, including the one where the boys were stuck. Everyone watched in horror as the water kept rushing in. Many stood there helplessly, while others kept on trying to keep the water at bay. By the dawn of the fourth day, the entire lower portion of the cave system was underwater. The side passage where the boys had been trapped was completely submerged. Jimenez had to be physically restrained from entering the flooded cave. He collapsed at the entrance, his anguished cries joining the sound of rushing water. The rain continued for 2 days, 2 whole days. The odds of survival for the boys were almost zero. The rescue site became a scene of mud, despair, and helpless anger. Villagers accused officials of acting too slowly. Officials blamed the weather and the difficult terrain. Arguments broke out between different groups of rescuers about what more could have been done. Through it all, the water continued to fill the cave system, erasing all hope of finding the boys alive. When the rain finally stopped, the water receded slowly from the cave. Officials from the state government arrived with pumping equipment to speed the process. When rescuers could finally re-enter, they found a transformed landscape. The flowing water had deposited new silt and moved rocks. The side passage was partially collapsed in sections. For a week, they searched. They widened the passage further, clearing debris and fighting through collapsed sections. They reached as far as the woman rescuer had reported hearing the boys, but found no sign of them. Further exploration revealed that the passage connected to a deeper system that descended at least 30 meters, 100 feet, before reaching a water-filled section that might extend for unknown distances. Officials concluded that the boys' bodies had been swept deeper into the cave system by the floodwaters. The formal search was called off after 10 days. Some local villagers, suspicious of outside authorities and their perceived lack of effort, continued searching on their own for weeks afterward. They too found nothing. The official report listed the cause of death as drowning, though no bodies were ever recovered. Questions remained about why the boys had ventured so deep into such a narrow passage, how they had become trapped, and why they couldn't make their way back. Some speculated that Miguel had become stuck pursuing the animal, and Pascual had refused to leave his brother. Others wondered if a partial collapse had trapped them before the flood. The Tipez Quintal, the unwitting catalyst for the disaster, was never found either. It likely fled deeper into the cave system or died of its wounds in some inaccessible crevice. Its fate, like that of the boys who pursued it, became part of the mountain's silent history. As for the father, he was never the same again. On the morning of June 25, 2004, Dan Garrison, age 38, and his 11-year-old son, Justin, prepared for what they thought would be a simple cave exploration. Their destination was Pepper Sauce Cave in Arizona, a limestone labyrinth known for its winding passages and challenging navigation. The outside temperature stood at a scorching 98 degrees Fahrenheit, 36.7 degrees Celsius, making the cool cave seem like the winter season. Dan had promised this adventure to Justin for his recent birthday, planning it as a special father-son experience they would remember fondly. Dan packed a small backpack with minimal supplies, 2 flashlights, a few snacks, and some water bottles. In his rush of excitement, he made 2 critical mistakes that would soon put their lives at risk. First, he failed to bring spare batteries for their flashlights. Second, he told no one, not even his wife, where they were going. These simple oversights would transform their adventure into a fight for survival. Dan was usually more careful, but his eagerness to show Justin the cave and his previous visit there years ago had made him overconfident. The pair arrived at Pepper Sauce Cave around noon. The entrance, a dark opening in the rocky hillside, swallowed them as they stepped inside. The temperature immediately dropped around them, and they switched on their flashlights to navigate the growing darkness. Justin gasped at the sudden change from bright desert sun to the cool shadows of the cave, his eyes taking time to adjust to the limited visibility. The passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger chambers, other times narrowing so much they had to crawl on hands and knees. The rough stones scraped their clothes and skin as they pushed forward, excited by each new discovery. Justin pointed out strange rock formations, while Dan explained how water had shaped the cave over thousands of years. They took turns leading the way, their footsteps echoing off the walls around them. After about 2 hours of exploration, they reached an area known as the Book Room, a chamber named for the visitor logbook kept there. They signed their names, noting the time and date of their visit. At this point, they had traveled through numerous passages, made countless turns, and descended to a lower level of the cave using a rope they had found fixed in place by previous explorers. The book room was larger than most areas they had seen, with enough space to stand up straight and move around freely. As their excitement began to fade and hunger set in, Dan decided it was time to head back to the entrance. They turned around, expecting to retrace their steps, but soon realized a troubling fact. The passages all looked the same. The route that had seemed so clear on the way in now appeared to be part of a confusing maze. The familiar landmarks looked strange and unfamiliar. What Dan thought was the main passage they had used earlier split into 3 separate tunnels, none of which seemed right. After an hour of wrong turns and backtracking, Dan's watch showed it was 4 p.m. The cave's constant 50-degree Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius temperature, which had felt refreshing at first, now began to chill them as their bodies tired and their movement slowed. Justin looked to his father with growing concern in his eyes. They were lost, and no one knew where to find them. Their snacks provided some energy but did little to warm them in the persistent cold of the underground environment. The reality of their situation grew more frightening with each passing hour. Every passage led to another that looked just like it. Every chamber branched into multiple tunnels. Without a map or proper caving experience, they had no way to know which direction would lead them out. Dan checked his flashlight and noticed the beam was already growing dimmer. Without spare batteries, darkness would eventually become their biggest enemy. The thought of being trapped in total blackness made Dan's heart race, though he tried to stay calm for Justin's sake. As 7 p.m. approached, Dan made a critical decision. Rather than continuing to wander aimlessly, they needed a system. Inside the book room, they found a notebook and pen left by previous cavers. Using the compass on Dan's wristwatch, they began to sketch the passages as they explored them, marking dead ends and noting distinctive features. Dan explained to Justin how the compass worked and showed him how to record their path with simple drawings and notes. Their makeshift mapping system gave them purpose, but it was slow work. By 10 p.m., their flashlights were noticeably dimmer, the snacks they had brought were gone, and their water supply was running low. The cave's silence pressed in on them, broken only by the occasional drip of water and their footsteps on the stone floor. The mapping had revealed several loops in the cave system, where passages connected in unexpected ways, making navigation even more confusing. Justin struggled to stay awake as midnight approached. Dan found a relatively flat area with sandy ground and told his son to rest while he continued mapping nearby passages. The 11-year-old curled up on the hard ground, using his thin jacket as a pillow. The constant temperature felt increasingly cold as their body heat drained into the cave floor. Dan checked on Justin frequently, worried about his son's comfort and well-being in the harsh cave environment. Throughout the night, Dan took short breaks to check on Justin and rest his own tired body. Sleep came in brief, uncomfortable stretches. The complete darkness when they turned off their failing flashlights to save power was unlike anything they had experienced before. A blackness so absolute it seemed solid. Dan calculated they had been in the cave for over 12 hours, and the thought of their families not knowing their whereabouts weighed heavily on him. Morning arrived in the world above, but in the depths of Pepper Sauce Cave, time had lost all meaning. Dan's watch showed 7 a.m. They had now been in the cave for 19 hours. Their situation was growing more desperate. Their flashlights would not last much longer. Thirst had become their constant companion. Dan rationed their last half bottle of water, giving most of it to Justin, while taking just enough to wet his own parched lips. Justin, despite his fear, remained remarkably calm for an 11-year-old. When he woke, he told his father that they needed water. Dan agreed, but had no idea where to find it. Justin suggested they listen for dripping sounds that might lead them to water. Dan was impressed by his son's clear thinking under pressure, a sign of maturity beyond his years in this dangerous situation. With new purpose, they began moving slowly through the passages, turning off their flashlights periodically to listen. Justin's sharp ears caught the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. They followed the sound, moving carefully in the direction it seemed to come from. The dripping grew louder as they navigated through narrow passages they hadn't explored before. As they rounded a corner, Justin's flashlight beam caught something unexpected, a rope hanging down from above. He froze, then called excitedly to his father. This was the same rope they had used the previous day to descend to the lower level of the cave. Dan recognized it immediately. The rope's frayed edges and knots were familiar marks they had noticed during their descent, confirming this was their path back. With renewed energy, Justin ran to get his father, who was exploring a nearby passage. Together, they climbed the rope to the upper level of the cave. From there, Dan recognized a formation they had passed on their way in. Following his memory and their crude map, they made steady progress toward the entrance. The map they had created through the night proved valuable, helping them avoid wrong turns they might have taken again. After nearly 24 hours in the depths of Pepper Sauce Cave, Dan and Justin saw a faint glow of natural light ahead. The cave entrance appeared, framing a patch of blue sky. They emerged into the blazing Arizona sunlight, squinting as their eyes adjusted to the brightness. The outside temperature had risen, but after the long, cold night underground, the heat felt wonderful on their tired bodies. The fresh air filled their lungs, replacing the damp, stale cave atmosphere they had breathed for a full day. Dan's car sat where they had left it, untouched. No search party had been organized because no one knew they were missing. Dan's wife had assumed they were visiting friends and would return later. If they had not found their way out, it might have been days before anyone realized they were gone. When they arrived home, Dan's wife was shocked to learn of their ordeal. The family agreed that future adventures would involve better planning and communication. On the morning of May 23, 1992, what should have been a carefree Memorial Day weekend adventure turned into a harrowing battle for survival beneath the Missouri earth. 3 cavers from nearby Fort Leonard Wood, eager to explore the natural wonders hidden below the surface, made their way to Waynesville Cave. None could have predicted how quickly their recreational excursion would transform into a desperate struggle against time, cold, and the unforgiving embrace of darkness. Waynesville Cave, nestled in the rolling Ozark Hills of central Missouri, had long attracted explorers with its mysterious passages and dramatic vertical drops. The cave's entrance, a dark gash in the limestone hillside, opened to a series of chambers connected by narrow passages and interrupted by steep vertical shafts. The largest of these drops plunged approximately 80 feet, 24.4 meters, into the cave's lower sections, a distance equivalent to falling from an 8-story building. Danny Gay, Michael, and Thomas arrived at the cave entrance shortly after sunrise. The air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle mixed with the earthy dampness wafting from the cave's mouth. Birds called in the distance as the men unpacked their gear, checking headlamps and preparing their vertical equipment for the challenging descent that awaited them. This is where the first critical error occurred. Danny, 27 years old, had arrived without proper vertical descent equipment. Rather than postponing their adventure, his companion Thomas offered to share his gear. Meanwhile, Danny himself improvised what cavers call a Texas rig, using a pair of short Petzl jammer ascenders. These mechanical devices, resembling metal hands with teeth, are designed to grip rope and allow climbers to ascend vertical surfaces by alternating weight between upper and lower attachment points. With sunshine still warming their backs, the 3 men ventured into the cave's mouth. The temperature dropped immediately, falling from the pleasant spring warmth outside, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius, to the cave's constant 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. The limestone walls pressed closer as they approached the main vertical shaft. Here, the cave seemed to swallow the surrounding earth, opening into a yawning pit that disappeared into blackness below. They could feel the cooler air rising from the depths, bringing with it the scent of ancient, undisturbed earth. Their voices echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing back at them from unseen walls and ceilings. The entrance to the pit measured barely 3 feet, 0.9 meters, across in places, forcing them to squeeze their bodies through while managing their equipment. The initial descent went smoothly. Each man carefully rigged his equipment to the main rope, which had been secured to a solid anchor point above. One by one, they disappeared into the vertical shaft, carefully controlling their descent. The sounds of equipment clinking and the occasional grunt of effort echoed upward as they made their way down. After exploring the lower chambers for several hours, the group began their ascent back toward daylight. The 3 had been immersed in near total darkness for hours, their world reduced to whatever their headlamp beams revealed. The constant dripping of water and their own breathing had become the soundtrack of their expedition. The trouble began during their climb out. The 80-foot, 24.4 meter vertical shaft that had been manageable on the way down now presented a serious challenge. Their equipment, previously dry and functioning properly, had become caked with the cave's sticky, slippery mud. Every surface, ropes, hand grips, carabiners, and ascenders, was now coated in this treacherous film. Thomas and Michael climbed out of the entrance drop without incident, but Danny, using his improvised Texas rig, began experiencing difficulty. The system required him to alternately stand and sit while moving specialized handles up the rope. The confined space of the vertical shaft meant he could barely see above his head. The walls closed in around him, sometimes forcing his body against cold, wet stone as he maneuvered upward. Approximately 65 feet, 19.8 meters up, just 15 feet, 4.6 meters from the top, disaster struck. During one of the sit-stand transitions, Danny's mud-slicked gloved hand accidentally dislodged the top ascender. In an instant, his weight transferred entirely to the single remaining foot attachment. His body flipped upside down, leaving him dangling precariously by one foot, spinning slowly in the dark void. The sudden inversion caused his helmet to slip, and his headlamp beams swung wildly across the shaft walls. Blood rushed to his head as he hung upside down. The cave's 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, temperature now feeling dramatically colder as panic set in. The shaft, approximately 5 feet, 1.5 meters, in diameter at this point, offered no ledges or protrusions to grasp. Danny was suspended in open space, the muddy rope his only connection to safety. His companions, having already reached the top, peered down into the darkness at their friend's predicament. They quickly realized the severity of the situation. Danny's attempts to right himself proved futile. Each time he reached for the rope, his mud-covered glove slipped helplessly on the equally mud-slicked line. The more he struggled, the more his body rotated, intensifying his disorientation. The confined dimensions of the shaft amplified his labored breathing, each desperate gasp echoing back from the close walls. The mud-coated rope refused to offer any grip to his frantically grasping hands. Hanging upside down, the blood pounding in his ears, Danny began experiencing the first signs of hypothermia. The cave's constant cool temperature, combined with the immobility of his predicament, was steadily draining his body heat. After 20 minutes of failed rescue attempts, Michael and Thomas made the difficult decision to seek outside help. With Danny still dangling in darkness, they navigated the remaining cave passages back to daylight. The contrast between the trapped cavers suspended in cold darkness and the warm spring afternoon above ground could not have been more stark. The local emergency medical service responded promptly to their call. A specialized cave rescue team was assembled, bringing proper equipment and experienced personnel. Moving efficiently but carefully, they entered the cave and made their way to the vertical shaft where Danny remained suspended. By this time, Danny had been hanging upside down for nearly 2 hours. His body temperature had dropped dangerously, and he was experiencing moderate hypothermia. His extremities had grown numb, and his thinking had become sluggish, a dangerous development considering his precarious position, 65 feet, 19.8 meters, above the cave floor. The rescue team lowered a specialist who secured Danny with additional safety lines. With patient precision, they corrected his inverted position and helped him complete the ascent to the top of the shaft. Throughout the rescue, the close confines of the passage required rescuers to work within inches of each other, their movements carefully orchestrated to avoid dislodging rocks or equipment. Once safely at the top, Danny was quickly assessed by medical personnel. His core temperature had dropped to approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, a mild but concerning level of hypothermia. Unable to walk unassisted due to circulation problems from hanging upside down, he was carefully transported through the remaining cave passages in a special stretcher designed for narrow spaces. Emerging into daylight after his ordeal, Danny was immediately wrapped in thermal blankets. The afternoon sun, now low in the western sky, cast long shadows across the rescue scene. Danny was transported to a nearby medical facility for treatment and observation, while his companions provided detailed accounts of the incident to authorities. The combination of improvised equipment, unfamiliar techniques, and the challenging cave environment created a perfect storm of danger.